He was once one of the most respected faces in Hollywood, an actor who did not need noise but always left a deep impression in every role. From the 1970s, with the haunting performance in Apocalypse Now, where he embodied Captain Willard in one of the greatest films of all time, to the iconic figure of President Josiah Bartlet in The West Wing, a role that brought Martin Sheen a prestigious Golden Globe along with multiple Emmy nominations, turning him into a symbol of integrity and intelligence on American television. He also received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, was honored by many arts organizations for his long-lasting contributions to film and television. Not stopping at acting, he was also an active social activist, participating in movements for peace, justice, and the environment, was arrested multiple times while protesting, but remained steadfast in his beliefs. His career spanned more than half a century, with hundreds of roles big and small, each role not just a job, but a part of who he was put on screen, creating a legacy that did not lie in the number of awards, but in the deep respect from colleagues and audiences. A person who did not need to prove who he was, because his life itself did that for him. A journey built on perseverance, discipline, and the belief that art could touch the deepest things in a person. But behind all those achievements was a man who had to pay the price with years that were never truly peaceful. A childhood that lost his mother too early, making him grow up with an unnamed feeling of emotional deprivation. A man who once turned to alcohol as the only way to cope with pressure and insecurity. An actor who had truly collapsed while filming Apocalypse Now, with a heart attack that nearly took his life when his career was still unfinished. And a father who had to stand by and watch his son, Charlie Sheen, sink deep into addiction and scandals without being able to do anything to save him. That was a pain that was not loud, but long-lasting, without an end. A feeling of helplessness when realizing there were things that could not be fixed, no matter how hard he tried. But it was precisely in those cracks that he still continued to stand firm, still chose to face things instead of running away, to find faith again, to find meaning again, not to become perfect, but to keep living, to keep being present, to keep doing what was right, even knowing that the past would never disappear. And perhaps that was his true willpower. Not never falling, but never abandoning his own life. If his story makes you pause and think, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way to acknowledge a person who has never stopped trying. And right now, we will go back to where it all began, where a boy learned how to stay silent before the whole world got to hear his voice. But to understand why a man like Martin Sheen carried a feeling of not being enough throughout his entire life, it is necessary to go back to a time when everything inside him began to change. Not through a loud event, but through a silence that stretched so long it became a part of who he was. The day his mother passed away, when he was still too young to fully understand the meaning of loss, but old enough to feel that from that moment the world was no longer the same. That was not only the departure of a loved one, but the disappearance of the only source of comfort he had ever known, the only person who could see him in a large family and call out the emotions he himself had not yet understood. And when she was gone, no one replaced that position. No one sat down to ask if he was scared or sad, if he needed a hug. Everything just continued, as if nothing had happened. As if a child's pain was too small to be noticed in a house where survival mattered more than emotions, and it was in that emptiness that a child began to learn how to stay silent, not because he was strong, but because there was no other choice. He learned to swallow everything inside, learned to stand there and endure without understanding why he had to do so. Because no one taught him that pain needed to be named, no one showed him how to speak out what was happening inside him, and so silence became something familiar, a natural reflex whenever something exceeded his ability to bear. In a family with too many children, affection did not disappear, but it was divided, scattered, not deep enough to reach each individual. And Martin became one of the children who learned to exist on his own in that emptiness, not because he was especially strong, But because he had no one to rely on, his father was a man who worked non-stop, carrying the responsibility of supporting the whole family. But he was not someone who could sit down and talk about emotions. He did not know how to turn pain into words, and therefore he could not teach his son to do that either. And in that absence, Martin grew up with a very simple but very dangerous belief that emotions should be kept hidden, that pain must be endured alone, that needing others was a sign of weakness. And over time, that belief sank deep into the way he saw the world, the way he saw himself. He no longer sought comfort, no longer expected anyone to understand him. He just kept going, kept living, kept existing, as if that was the only thing he could do. But beneath that calmness was an emptiness that never truly disappeared, a feeling of being left behind without explanation, without an end, only continuation. He did not remember exactly everything that happened in the days after his mother died, but he remembered the feeling that everything became colder, farther, harder to reach. And from then on, he began to look at the world with a distance, not because he wanted to, but because he did not know how to do otherwise. He did not cry much, not because it did not hurt, but because he did not know how to cry. No one gave him the language to express sadness. No one gave him the space to go through loss. And so he kept it all inside, little by little, day by day, until it became a part of who he was, no longer separate, no longer clear, just simply there, always there. And when he grew up, when he began to step into the larger world, when he began to pursue dreams that no one around him really understood, he carried that emptiness like invisible luggage. It did not stop him from moving forward, but it made each step heavier, made each success less complete, because deep inside, there was still a child who had never been told that everything would be okay, a child who was still waiting for comfort that never came. And no matter how much his life changed later, no matter who he became, no matter how many people knew him, that feeling remained, not loud, not clear, but persistent, like an underground current beneath the surface, shaping the way he loved, the way he lived, and the way he saw himself. A feeling that something had been lost very early and there was no way to get it back, only to continue living with it, day after day, year after year, as an inseparable part of who he was. And when that emptiness had become an inseparable part, life continued to push Martin Sheen forward, giving him no time to stop or understand what he was carrying. He grew up in a family where every day was tied to the pressure of survival, where having enough food, enough money to sustain life mattered more than any emotion. And in such an environment, no one had the chance to become special. No one had the space to be noticed. Everything revolved around existing. And Martin, or more accurately, Ramon Estevez at that time, was just one of many children trying to find his place. But the more he tried, the more he felt he did not stand out, was not good enough, not special enough to be seen. In a large family, comparison did not need to be spoken. It existed on its own, in the way adults perceived things, in the way other children were noticed, and gradually a thought began to form in him, not that he had no value, but that his value was not enough to be recognized, and that was a very small difference. But it changed everything, because when a child believed he was not enough, he would begin to live in a way that tried to compensate, tried harder, did more, sacrificed more, just to get something others had naturally, which was to be seen, to be recognized. And that very thought followed him through the years of growing up, when he began to leave the familiar environment and step into a larger world, where competition was harsher, where no one cared where you came from, only what you could bring. And in that world, the name Ramon Estevez became a barrier, not because it was not beautiful, but because it did not fit what Hollywood wanted to see, and so he stood before a choice that many people never had to face, to keep his own identity and accept being overlooked, or to change himself to have a chance. And he chose to change. He chose the name Martin Sheen, a name that was easier to pronounce, easier to accept, a name that could open doors. The old name could not, but the price of that choice was not just a name. It was the feeling that to be recognized, he had to become someone else, that his true self was not enough to exist in this world, and although that decision helped him go further in his career, it also left a crack inside, a quiet question that if success came to Martin Sheen, then who was Ramon Estevez, and whether his true self would ever really be accepted or not. And from that point on, the thought of having to try harder than others was no longer a choice. It became an obligation, something mandatory. He could not just do enough, he had to do more, could not just be good. He had to be better, not because he wanted to prove anything to the world, but because he was trying to prove something to himself, that he deserved to be here, that he was not a replacement, not an edited version to fit in, but a person with real value. But the more he tried, the more he realized that feeling did not disappear. It only changed shape, from a child in a large family to a man in a big world. But the question remained the same, whether he was enough yet. And there was no answer that truly satisfied him, because the root of the problem did not lie in what he achieved, but in the way he saw himself. And that way of seeing had been formed very early, from the years when he learned to exist without being noticed, learned to try without being recognized, and learned to accept that sometimes, even if you did everything right, you could still feel you were not enough. And that was not a passing moment, it was a prolonged state, an underground current that influenced every decision, every choice, every step afterward, making each success come with doubt, each opportunity come with the fear that he would not keep it. And over time, that did not stop him, but it made each step heavier, each achievement less complete, because deep inside, there was still a boy who had never truly believed he deserved what he had. And when the belief that he was not enough had taken root too deeply, the next step for Martin Sheen was not a powerful breakthrough, but a series of quiet choices, sometimes almost hopeless. He decided to pursue acting without any foundation, without any guidance, without anyone really standing behind him to say that he could do it. That did not come from confidence, but from a very different need, a need to find meaning for himself, to prove that his life was not just a series of quiet existences among others, but the world he stepped into did not wait for him, did not welcome him, and did not care who he was. It was a world where every opportunity had to be fought for, every door closed faster than it opened, and in the early years he had almost nothing but persistence. He did every job to survive, jobs no one remembered the name of, no one noticed, from manual labor to temporary gigs just to pay the rent, to eat through the day, to be able to stay one more week in a city that seemed not meant for him. During the day he worked. At night, he went to auditions, stood in long lines, waiting for the chance to step into a room where people would look at him for a few minutes and decide whether he was worth existing in this industry or not. And most of the time, the answer was no, not suitable enough, not impressive enough, not special enough. The rejections were not always spoken. Sometimes they were just silence, no callbacks, his name never mentioned, and each time like that he carried a little more doubt, a repeating question that maybe they were right. Maybe he really did not belong here. Maybe all these efforts were just prolonging something that had been predetermined, that he would never be enough. There were periods when he lived in prolonged uncertainty, not clear failure, but a state of being in between, unable to move forward, but also unable to go back. And that state was what exhausted people the most because there was no endpoint, no answer, only waiting and hope that grew thinner over time. He began to doubt not only his ability but also his choice, wondering if he was on the wrong path, if there was another life that was easier, more stable that he had passed up. But every time the thought of giving up appeared, it was not strong enough to pull him away from this path. Because deep inside, though very small, there was still something that refused to disappear, the dream. Not a dream of fame or money, but a dream of becoming someone who mattered, of being seen, of being recognized, of existing in a way he had never had when he was a child. And that dream, though fragile, though extinguished many times, was still the only thing that kept him there, kept him continuing to step into rooms where he knew the chance of rejection was very high, kept him continuing to do jobs unrelated to his dream just to exist one more day, kept him continuing to believe, even if only a very small part, that maybe, just maybe, there would be a day when everything changed. But throughout that period, there was no sign that it would happen, no confirmation, no guarantee, only a young man trying to hold on to something that even he himself was not sure was real. And perhaps the hardest thing was not the rejections, but having to continue believing in himself when there was no evidence to prove that belief was right. And then, after so many rejections, after years standing on the edge of a world not meant for him, Martin Sheen finally began to get work. Small roles appeared. Opportunities that previously seemed not to exist, but when he stepped into them, he quickly realized that having work did not mean being seen. He was no longer standing outside the door, but that did not mean he had truly stepped inside. The roles he got were often short, faint, without enough depth to show his true self. He appeared, did his part, then disappeared before the audience had time to remember his name, and each time like that, he wondered if this was all he could achieve. If this was the limit the world had set for him from the beginning, not because he did not try, but because he was not enough to be given more. He looked at others, those who had bigger opportunities, roles with more weight, and could not avoid comparing, not with jealousy, but with a quiet sadness, a feeling that he was very close, but still could not reach. And while his career gradually took shape, his personal life began to go in a direction that even he did not fully understand. He got married very young to Janet Templeton, not because everything was ready, but because he needed something certain in a life full of too much instability. Needed a place to belong, a family to fill the emptiness he had carried since he was a child. But when a person who did not yet understand himself stepped into a deep relationship, the unresolved things did not disappear. They only changed form and appeared in different ways. He became a husband, became a father, but inside he was still a man searching for answers for himself. And that made everything more complicated, because now he not only had to face his personal doubts, but also had to carry the responsibility of a family. Bills that needed to be paid, children who needed care, expectations that needed to be met. And while he was still trying to find his footing in his career, those pressures grew bigger. Not suddenly, but quietly, little by little, each day a bit, until he realized he was no longer working just for the dream. He worked for duty, for responsibility, for the people who depended on him. And that changed the way he looked at everything. Acting was no longer just a personal dream. It became a means to survive, a way to ensure his family could continue to live. And that change brought another pressure, a pressure not from proving himself, but from the fear that failure would bring consequences for others. He no longer had the right to make mistakes freely, no longer had space to try and fail without paying a price. Every decision carried weight, every opportunity became more important, and in that context, the feeling of not being recognized became heavier than ever, because he did not just need success for himself. He needed success to keep everything from falling apart. And when that did not happen the way he hoped, when he was still seen as a supporting actor, a person not prominent enough to be given big roles, he began to feel like he was running on a road with no endpoint, always moving forward but never arriving. And there were nights, after everything had quieted down, after the day's responsibilities had temporarily settled, he sat alone with thoughts he could not speak, wondering if everything he was doing was really leading to something or just a way to prolong a life he had never truly felt he belonged to. And whatever the answer was, the next morning he still woke up, still continued, not because he was sure, but because he had no other choice. And perhaps that was what made this period so heavy. Not because it was full of big events, but because it dragged on, quietly, and there was no clear moment to say that everything had changed. Only a man working, trying, enduring, but still not seen in the way he had always wanted. And precisely in those years that seemed stable, when everything on the outside gradually took shape, but inside was cracking more and more, Martin Sheen began to turn to a way to soothe everything he could not name. Alcohol did not come to him as a clear choice. It appeared gradually, creeping into the evenings after work. The moments he wanted to turn off the noise in his head, wanted to slow down the thoughts that kept spinning. At first, it was just a way to relax, a way to create a temporary feeling of relief after long days full of pressure. But that feeling did not last, and to keep it a little longer, he needed more. One drink became two, two became three, and before he realized it, what had once been a choice had become a need. He was not always drunk, but he always needed alcohol there, like an invisible support he could hold on to, when everything inside began to feel too heavy. And the scariest thing was not that he drank, but that he was no longer sure he could stop, because each time he tried to face himself without alcohol, the emotions he had tried to suppress for many years surged up stronger, clearer, and harder to control. He did not just feel sad. He felt lost, felt like he was living a life he did not fully understand. And in that state, alcohol was not just a way to escape. It became a way to exist, a way to continue through each day without being overwhelmed by questions with no answers. But at the same time, another contradiction began to form. A contradiction he could not ignore, because now he was no longer just a man trying to find his place in the world. He was a father, a husband, a person others looked to, trusted, and depended on. And that image did not match the person he felt inside. He looked at his family and knew they deserved a better version of him. A person fully present, a solid person, a person who could be a support. But each time he tried to become that person, he felt like he was acting, like he was playing a role he did not really understand. And that created a distance not only between him and his family, but between him and himself. He began to realize he did not control everything as he once thought, that his life was not a straight line he could steer, but a series of reactions, small choices leading to results he did not always want. And that feeling of losing control did not come from a specific event. It accumulated little by little through long nights, through moments he knew he should stop but could not, through times he told himself tomorrow would be different. But then tomorrow was exactly like today, and in all of that, a fear began to grow. A fear he did not easily admit, that the person he was becoming was not the person he wanted to become, not the father he hoped to be, not the man he once thought he would be when he was young. And that fear was not loud. It did not appear in a clear moment. It was there in the silences, in the times he looked in the mirror and was not sure who he was seeing, in the times he felt he was slowly slipping away from a version he had never truly reached. And what made it all harder was that he did not know where to start to change, because the problem was not in a single habit, not in a single decision. It lay in the way he looked at life, the way he faced emotions, things that had been formed long before alcohol appeared. And so even though he realized he was going in the wrong direction, turning back was not as simple as stopping drinking. It required him to face everything he had avoided, to look straight at the emptiness he had tried to fill with work, with responsibility, with anything that could keep him from stopping and thinking. And that was something he was not ready for, or perhaps did not yet know how to do. And so he continued to live in a state where on the outside everything still operated, still moved forward, but inside a part of him was gradually losing direction, gradually losing the feeling of control, and gradually becoming a stranger to himself, a process with no clear stopping point, no explosive moment, only a slow slide, slow enough that no one around noticed, but deep enough that he felt it every day. And in all of that, perhaps the most painful thing was not what was happening, but the fact that he realized it was happening and still did not know how to change. And then came a point where everything he had tried to suppress, every warning sign he had ignored, all converged at once in an experience that Martin Sheen would never be able to forget. When he joined the film Apocalypse Now, a project that demanded not only acting, but also wore down both body and mind, filmed under harsh conditions in the Philippines, where the heat, humidity, and isolation created an environment with almost no room for weakness. And in that context, he did not just carry his role, he carried everything he had been through, the years of self-doubt, the family pressures, the drinking habit that had become part of his life. All of it blended together and gradually pushed him to a limit he himself did not realize he was approaching. The filming days stretched long. The scenes were intense, the immersion so deep that he no longer clearly distinguished where the character ended and he began. He did not just act. He lived in the state the role demanded. And that state was not always stable. There were times he was exhausted, times he felt disoriented, but he kept going because stopping was not an option, not only because of his responsibility to the crew, but also because a part of him still believed this was the opportunity he had been waiting for, that if he could get through this, everything would change. But his body had a limit that willpower could not overcome forever. And one day that limit was broken, with no clear warning, no dramatic sign, just a moment when everything inside him suddenly stopped working as before. He had a heart attack at 36 years old, an age when most people still think they have so much time ahead, and in that moment, all the things he had tried to control disappeared. There was no role, no career, no image he tried to maintain, only a body fighting to survive, a heart that could no longer bear the pressure it had carried for so long. And what made that experience so terrifying was not just the physical pain, but the very clear awareness that he could die there, far from family, far from loved ones, in a place where no one truly belonged to him, and ending with no preparation, no chance to say final words. And in that moment, everything became clear in a way he had never before allowed himself to see. He realized that everything he was doing, all the pressure he was enduring, all the things he was trying to prove could vanish in a single second. And there was no guarantee he would have more time to fix things, to redo them, to become a better version. And that did not bring relief. It brought a deep fear because it forced him to face a truth he had avoided, that life was not something he could postpone indefinitely, that things left unsaid, things left undone might never have the chance to be completed. And in the days after, while he was still alive but not yet fully recovered, the line between what he had experienced in the role and what he had just experienced in reality became blurrier than ever, because both were extreme experiences. Both pushed him to limits he did not think he could reach, and there were moments he was not sure whether he was remembering a filmed scene or a real experience, because the feelings were the same. The exhaustion, the loss of control, the closeness to death, all of it blended together and created a state he could not easily separate. And when he looked back, he did not just see a film. He saw a part of his life captured, not in the way he had planned, but in the way he had planned, but in the way circumstances had forced. A part of his life that he had paid for with his own health. And perhaps for the first time he truly understood that there were prices no success could compensate for, that there were boundaries that, once crossed, did not just change your life, but changed who you were. And from that moment, even if he continued onward, continued working, continued building his career, there was one thing that had changed permanently. He was no longer the person who believed he could endure everything without consequences. He had seen his own limits, and the memory of that moment would stay with him like a reminder he could not forget. That sometimes the body would say what the mind tried to deny, and when it spoke, you had no choice but to listen. And after surviving the moment when the line between life and death became so thin it almost did not exist, Martin Sheen continued to live. His body recovered gradually, his heartbeat returned to normal, Work continued. The film still had to be finished. Life still had to move forward as if nothing could stop it. But one thing had changed in a way no one could see immediately. He was no longer the same person as before. Not in the sense that he became weaker or stronger, but in the sense that a part of him was no longer whole, as if something had been left behind in the moment he faced death. A feeling very hard to name, not a clear fear, but a quiet awareness that life was uncertain, that everything he once believed was stable could disappear in a moment without warning. And that awareness did not bring peace. It brought a constant vigilance, a feeling that anything could happen, that nothing was truly under control. And from then on, the way he looked at everything began to change. He was no longer a man who believed that if he tried long enough, everything would be fine. He began to understand that there were things that did not depend on effort. There were limits that willpower could not overcome. And that forced him to look back at himself, not with confidence, but with a new caution, a doubt about what he once thought was certain. He began to think more about what was truly important. Not just work, not just proving himself, but the way he lived, the way he was present in the lives of those around him. But that change did not happen clearly or completely. It came little by little, mixed with old habits, old ways of thinking, insecurities that had existed for a very long time. He could recognize that he needed to change, but recognizing it did not mean he could do it, because the emotional wounds he carried did not disappear just because of one major event. They did not vanish when he survived. They remained there, quietly but persistently, continuing to affect the way he reacted, the way he felt, the way he saw himself. And there were days he felt like he was starting over, as if he had been given another chance. But there were also days he felt like he was just continuing an old story with a different perspective, a story he had never truly understood completely. He continued to work, continued to take roles, continued to build his career. But now every step carried a new awareness of fragility, an awareness that nothing was permanent, that anything he had could disappear, and that made every success both more meaningful and less complete, because it always came with a question that never left him. How long would this last? How much time did he still have to do what he thought was important? And while he continued to live, continued to move forward, there was a feeling that never truly left. A feeling that something was still missing. Not an unmet goal, not an unfinished achievement, but a wholeness he had never truly reached, as if he was always very close but never completely there. And perhaps that was what made this period so hard to describe. Not a clear collapse, but a continuation with an emptiness inside, an emptiness he could not fill with work, with success, or with anything external. He was still there, still continuing, still living, but always carrying the feeling that a part of him had stopped somewhere in the past, and no matter how far he went, that part would never catch up. And as time passed after that event, Martin Sheen's life gradually entered a more stable orbit. His career began to make clear progress. The roles were no longer faint like before. Bigger opportunities appeared, and for the first time in many years, he no longer had to worry every day about whether he could continue to exist in this industry or not. His name began to be mentioned more often, no longer an easily forgotten face, but an actor who could bring depth to a character, who could hold the audience's attention. And in some way, the things he had tried for so long finally began to show results. But precisely in the period that many people would call success, one other thing became clearer than ever: that what he achieved on the outside did not correspond to what he felt inside. There was no moment when he woke up and felt everything was fine, no point where he could say he had finally arrived, because the sense of lack he had carried for so long did not disappear when his career changed. It only continued to exist in a different context, in different forms. He could stand in front of the camera with confidence, could complete roles with high focus, could receive recognition from people he once hoped would notice him. But when those moments ended, when the lights went out, When he returned to himself, that familiar feeling was still there, not loud but undeniable, an emptiness without a clear shape, but strong enough to affect the way he experienced everything. And what made it harder to accept was that he could not explain it by what was happening in the present. Because from the outside, everything was getting better. He had stable work, a family, opportunities he could only have imagined before, but inside the old questions still had no answers. The unresolved emotions continued to exist, and that made him begin to realize that there were things that could not be fixed just by changing circumstances, that fame, money, or recognition had no power to reach what had been formed very early, could not replace what had been missing, could not fill gaps that had existed for too long. And that awareness did not come suddenly. It came from very small moments, times when he realized that the joy from a success did not last as long as he expected, that recognition from others was not enough to soothe the doubt inside, that no matter how much more he achieved, that feeling would still remain. And from then on, the way he looked at his career also began to change. No longer a path leading to a clear endpoint, but part of a more complex journey where success and lack could exist side by side, where you could achieve a lot, but still feel like you were missing something important. And that forced him to face a truth that was not easy to accept. That what he was looking for was not outside, not in bigger roles, not in wider recognition, but in the things he had avoided for a very long time, the wounds from the past, the unnamed emotions, the experiences he had never truly allowed himself to understand fully. And facing them was not something he could do easily, because it required him to stop, to look at the parts of himself he had tried to ignore, to accept that there were things that could not be completely fixed, only understood and carried. And in that process he continued to live, continued to work, continued to move forward, but with a clearer awareness that life was not a problem that could be solved by success, that there were cracks that did not disappear when you achieved more, but only became clearer when you had enough silence to notice them. And perhaps that was what made this period deeper, not because of what he achieved, but because of what he began to understand. That healing did not come from what the world gave you, but from the way you faced what you had carried throughout your life. And precisely when he began to understand that the emptiness inside could not be filled by success, another reality gradually became clear, a reality even harder to accept, that while Martin Sheen was trying to find answers for himself, he had stepped into the role of father without ever truly understanding himself. He had a family, he had children, he had a home he had longed for since he was a child, but what he brought into it was not certainty or stability, but all the unresolved things from the past. And that made his role as a father never begin from a solid foundation. He had no clear model to follow, no full memory of being raised with understanding and shared emotions. So when it was his turn to become the guide, he had to learn everything from the beginning while still trying to understand himself. And that created a distance he did not notice immediately because on the outside he still did what a father was expected to do. He worked to support the family. He made sure the children had what they needed materially. He was present in the way he knew how, but inside there was a part of him that did not know how to connect more deeply, did not know how to say the important things, did not know how to listen in the way his children needed. And while he continued to move forward with his career, with more and more opportunities and bigger projects, his time became increasingly divided, and there were important moments in his children's lives when he was not there. Not because he did not care, but because he did not know how to balance, did not know how to stop, did not know that there were things that could not wait, moments that once missed would never come back, and those gaps, at first very small, gradually accumulated over time. Not loudly, not clearly, but enough to create a distance between him and his children, a distance that could not be measured by time but by feeling, the feeling that something was missing, that there were things left unsaid, left unshared, and later on, As the children grew up, that distance did not disappear on its own. It became clearer because each person began to have their own life, their own thoughts, and what had not been built earlier could not easily be created in the present. He began to realize that he was not just a father absent in a few moments, but a person who arrived late in many aspects of family life. He could be there physically, but not always there emotionally, and that awareness did not come all at once. It came little by little, through the times he tried to connect but did not know where to start, through the times he realized he did not fully understand what his children were going through the moments he felt he was standing outside the life of his own family. And that brought a feeling very hard to name, not simple regret, but a realization that time had passed in a way he could not go back to change, that there were things he could have done differently, but now they were only thoughts, no longer choices. And in all of that, there was a feeling that grew clearer, that he was always arriving late, not because he did not try, but because he did not understand the importance of small moments when they were happening. And when he began to understand, when he began to want to do better, many things had already changed, many things had already passed, and he had to face the reality that being a father was not just about being present, but about understanding, about connecting, about knowing when to stop and when to step forward, things he was never taught and had to learn on his own while time did not wait. And that was exactly what made his role as a father an incomplete journey, not because of a lack of love, but because of a lack of ways to express it. And perhaps the most painful thing was not that he had done something wrong, but that he realized it when it was already too late to start over. And when he began to realize that he had arrived late in his role as a father, life brought another challenge that no father is truly ready to face. When the events of Charlie Sheen no longer stayed within the family but exploded in public, in the media, in front of millions of watching eyes. And for Martin Sheen, that was not just a personal story but a pain laid bare, something he could not hide, could not protect, could not keep to himself. He had known that his son was struggling. The signs of trouble had not appeared suddenly, but when everything went out of control, when stories of addiction, uncontrolled behavior, and shocking statements spread everywhere, everything was no longer within a father's ability to intervene, and that created a deep sense of helplessness, a feeling no experience in life could have prepared him for, because this was not a problem he could solve with effort, not a challenge he could overcome with willpower. This was another person, another life, a chain of choices he could not control. And no matter how close he stood, no matter how much he cared, there was still a distance he could not cross, a boundary he could not erase. He looked at his son, not just as a famous actor, not just as a name in the media, but as the child he had once held in his arms, watched grow up, and hoped would have a better life. And those very memories made everything more painful because he did not just see the present. He saw everything that had led to the present. The moments he had not been there, the times he had not understood, the gaps he once thought were not important, all of it seemed to converge in a reality he could not change. And each time a new piece of news appeared, each time a new story spread, he had to face it as a father, not as a spectator, not as an outsider, but as someone deeply connected to every detail, every mistake, every consequence. And that brought not only pain, but also a sense of responsibility he could not easily set aside, not because he had caused it all, but because he was the father. And in that role, he could not help but wonder if he could have done something differently, if there had been a moment when he could have changed the direction of his son's life, if there was a way he had missed. And those questions had no clear answers. They simply existed, repeating, giving him no stopping point. He could talk, he could try, he could stay by his side, but he could not decide for his son, could not live for him, could not endure for him. And that was exactly what made this situation the hardest, because there was no action enough to solve it, no solution that was certain to work, only presence, patience, and a fragile hope that things could change. But time did not stand still, and the events did not wait. They continued to happen, continued to pile up. And each time like that, he had to face the same feeling that he was standing outside something very important, something he wanted to step into but was not allowed, a battle he could not join, even though it was his own son's battle. And in all of that there was a prolonged pain with no clear endpoint. Not a single moment, but a chain of days and months when he had to witness, had to accept, had to live with the reality that there were things he could not fix, could not protect, could not keep safe. And that affected not only the way he looked at his son, but also the way he looked at himself. Because each time he felt helpless, each time he recognized his own limits, he faced a part of himself he did not want to admit that despite trying, despite changing, despite learning so much, there were still places he could not reach. And in the role of father, there was no heavier feeling than knowing your child was falling apart and you could not do anything to stop it. Only stand there, continue to be by their side, continue to hope, and continue to carry that pain through each day as a part of life he could never separate from. And when he had gone through the years when even a father's love was not enough to hold everything together, when the feeling of helplessness was no longer fleeting, but had become a familiar part of life, Martin Sheen began to look for something that was not in what he once knew, not a clear solution, not a way to fix everything, but a support so he could stand firm without being swept away by what he could not control. And he turned back to faith, not as a rational choice, but as a natural response when everything else seemed no longer effective. He did not turn to it because he believed it would completely change his life, but because he needed a place to put the questions he could not answer himself, a place to bring the feelings he could not explain, a place where weakness was not seen as failure. And in that process, he began to look back at everything he had been through, not to judge, but to understand, to realize that there were mistakes that could not be erased but could be acknowledged, could be placed in a broader context where a person was not completely defined by what they had done wrong, but by the way they continued afterward. He did not deny his past, did not try to rewrite it in a more acceptable way. He faced it with all its imperfections, the decisions he wished he had made differently, the moments he knew he had not been present in the way he should have been. And precisely in that confrontation, he began to look for a form of forgiveness, not forgiveness from others, but the forgiveness he had to learn to give himself, because otherwise he would continue to carry those burdens with no way to move forward. And faith gave him a way to see everything, not just as individual mistakes, but as part of a larger journey, a journey in which a person is not measured only by what they achieve, but by what they learn, by what they change, and by the way they continue to live even without the guarantee that things will get better. Alongside that process, he began to participate in social activities, not to build an image, but because he felt the need to connect with something beyond himself. He joined protests, spoke out on issues he believed were important, accepted the consequences that came with them, not because he thought he could change the world, but because he did not want to continue staying silent in front of things he felt needed to be spoken about. And in those actions he found a different form of meaning, a form of presence not related to roles or fame, but related to becoming part of something bigger, a way to live that was not only focused on what he had lost, but on what he could still do. And little by little, his life began to take a different direction, not a sudden change, but a gradual adjustment, a process in which he tried to rebuild from what remained, accepted what could not be changed, and focused on what was still within reach. And in all of that, faith did not become an answer to every problem. It did not erase the pain, did not resolve every contradiction, but it gave him a foundation, a way to stand firm when everything around him was uncertain, a way to continue living without needing to have all the answers. And perhaps the most important thing was not that he found faith, but that he found a way to continue, a way not to be stopped by what he could not change, a way to exist without needing to be perfect. And in that journey, he did not become a completely different person. He remained himself with all his unfinished parts, But one thing had changed. He no longer looked for a life without mistakes. He began to accept a life in which meaning did not come from perfection, but from persistence, from continuing to move forward even knowing that there were things that would never be completely fixed. And then, when he had learned to stand firmer in himself, when faith became a quiet support that helped him not be swept away by the things he could not control, life brought Martin Sheen to one of the most iconic roles, the role of President Josiah Bartlet in The West Wing, an image that millions of Americans trusted. A leader with calm intelligence and clear morality, a person who could make difficult decisions while still keeping compassion, a character who, when he appeared, brought the feeling that everything could finally be controlled, that there was someone standing there who understood the situation and knew what to do. And for many years that image was attached to him, not only on screen but also in the way the public saw him in real life. They did not just see an actor, they saw a symbol of integrity, a man who seemed to always know what was right, who could always hold his ground in the most complicated circumstances. And that created a paradox he could not avoid because while the world saw him as someone who could solve every problem, his personal life did not reflect that. His family still carried cracks from the past. The distances that had formed over many years did not easily disappear. The issues he had once tried to face still existed, not always clearly, but enough for him to feel that everything was not as perfect as the image he showed on screen. And that put him in a very difficult position, not because he had to maintain an image, but because he had to live with the difference between two worlds. One world where he was given the right lines already written, where he could make decisions that brought clear results, and one world where everything was much more complicated, where there was no script, no right answers, where love, failure, and helplessness existed at the same time and could not be solved by just one right decision. And in that process, he began to look at his role in a different way, not as a model he needed to become, but as a contrast that helped him understand himself more clearly. He knew he was not the perfect man the audience saw. He knew he had made mistakes, that there were things he could not fix, that there were places in his life where he had no answers. And instead of trying to close that gap, he began to accept it, to accept that his real self was not like the image on screen. And that did not make him less valuable. It only made him more real. He no longer tried to become an ideal version, no longer searched for a perfect state he had never truly reached. He began to live with what he had, with the parts that had been healed and the parts that were still unfinished. And in that acceptance, there was a different kind of peace. Not peace from everything being okay, but peace from no longer having to pretend that everything was okay. He could stand in front of the public, continue working, continue performing roles he believed in, but inside he was no longer bound by having to become a model. He allowed himself to exist as a human with all the contradictions, the limits, the unresolved things. And perhaps that was one of the most important changes. Not that he became better by some standard, but that he became more honest with himself, accepting that there were parts of his life that would never be like what he had once imagined, that there were stories without a perfect ending, and the only thing he could do was continue to live in that reality without hiding, without avoiding, and without trying to turn it into something else. And when the years had passed long enough for all the successes to settle into memories, when the roles were no longer the center of life but only milestones left behind, Martin Sheen stepped into 85 years old with a slower, quieter, and perhaps truer rhythm of life. He was no longer chasing anything, no longer trying to prove who he was, no longer setting big goals like before. But that did not mean he had found all the answers, because when he looked back at his entire journey, the emotions did not come in one single direction. They intertwined and overlapped. There was gratitude for what he had, there was regret for what he had lost, and there were silences he could not name. Silences that appeared when he remembered what had happened and realized they could not be changed, could not be redone. The mistakes of the past did not disappear with time. They only changed the way they existed, from specific actions into memories. But those memories did not become lighter. They only became more familiar, and there were times, in quiet moments, when he could still feel their weight, not like a punishment, but like a part of who he was, a part that had helped shape every decision, every choice, every way he looked at the world, and that forced him to face a truth he had gradually accepted, that there were things in life that could not be fixed, not because he did not want to, but because time had passed and would not return, that there were moments that once missed would stay behind forever, with no second chance, no way to rewrite them. And accepting that was not a simple decision. It was a process in which he had to learn to let go of the idea of a perfect life, had to learn to look at the past without being pulled back by it, had to learn to exist with what was unfinished without letting it define his entire self. And in that process, he began to change the way he looked at the present, no longer focusing on what he had lost, but on what still remained. The relationships that still existed, the moments that could still be experienced, the small things he might not have noticed before. He spent more time with family, not to fix everything, but to be present in the way he could. He did not try to become someone else, did not try to compensate with big actions. He was just there, listening more, speaking less. And in that simplicity, there was a kind of meaning he had not recognized before. But even in those changes, there were things that still did not disappear. The unfinished memories remained. Not always clearly, but enough for him to remember that life was not a story that could be made completely whole, that there were parts that would always be incomplete, not because he had not tried, but because that was the nature of every journey. And instead of fighting against that, he learned to live with it, not seeing it as a failure, but as part of the truth, part of becoming human. And perhaps that was what 85 years old brought him. Not release from the past, but the ability to look at it without being controlled by it. The ability to continue living without needing to solve everything. The ability to accept that there were questions that would never have answers. And that did not make life less meaningful. It only made it more real, closer to what it had always been. An imperfect journey, but still worth continuing. And when looking back at the entire journey that had passed, from a boy who grew up in silence to a man stepping into 85 years old with memories that never truly left, Martin Sheen's story was not a straight upward line, not a journey where every difficulty led to a complete ending, but a chain of experiences intertwined between effort and loss, between what was achieved and what remained unfinished. He had gone through a childhood lacking comfort, carrying the feeling of not being enough into his adult years, stepping into a world that did not wait for him, with very little assurance that everything would change. He had worked, had tried, had persisted on a path where no one could promise anything. And then when opportunities appeared, when his career began to take shape, he again had to face inner battles that no role could cover. He had survived a heart attack while still very young, a moment that could have ended everything but instead became a marker for a life that continued, a life no longer the same as before. He had become a father, while still trying to understand himself, had tried to be present in a role where he did not have enough tools to complete it the way he wanted. And when the events happened with Charlie Sheen, he had to face a kind of helplessness that no success could lighten. A prolonged pain with no clear endpoint, no complete solution, only continuation, presence, and an uncertain hope. He had turned to faith not as a complete answer, but as a way to continue when everything else was no longer enough. He had participated in things bigger than himself to find meaning in a world he could not fully control. He had stood before the public in the role of an ideal president in the West Wing, while inside still carrying contradictions that no one could rewrite into a perfect script. And through all of that, one thing became clear. He did not achieve perfection. There was no moment when everything in his personal life became whole in the way he had once hoped. There were relationships that were never completely healed. Decisions he still carried questions about whether he could have done differently. memories that did not disappear no matter how far he went. But what kept his story from stopping there was not that he had fixed everything, but that he did not abandon what remained unresolved. He did not turn his back on the most difficult parts of his life, did not pretend they did not exist, did not try to replace them with successes or external images. He continued to live with them, continued to face them, day by day, moment by moment, in the way he could. And in that continuation, there was a quiet kind of strength, one that did not need recognition. A strength that lay in not giving up, not with the world, but with his own life. He did not need to become a perfect model to have value, did not need to prove that everything was okay to keep moving forward. He moved forward even knowing that there were things that would never be completely okay. And that was exactly what created his legacy. Not just the roles, not just the awards or recognition, but the way he had lived, the way he had faced what was hardest, the way he had continued even without the guarantee that things would get better. A man who did not win in the way the world usually defined it, but was also not defeated. A person who had endured, had changed, had learned to live with what could not be changed, and still remained, still was present, still kept going. And perhaps that was what his story left behind, not a complete lesson, but an image. The image of an imperfect person carrying many cracks, many unfinished memories, but still choosing to stay with his life, not leaving, not letting go. And in that choice there was a meaning that did not need to be explained, only to be seen, to be felt, and to be remembered as part of what makes people more resilient than they once thought possible. Martin Sheen's story is not an epic of victory, but a journey that makes people pause because of the persistence and pain. From a boy who lost his mother too early, grew up in silence, and the feeling of not being enough, to a man who achieved fame but still could not heal the emptiness inside. Details like him changing his name to be accepted, the years of rejection in acting, or the heart attack while filming Apocalypse Now, are not just isolated events, but layers of pressure stacked on each other, forming a person who always had to try harder to prove his worth. But perhaps what makes the story most painful is not what he went through for himself, but having to watch Charlie Sheen, his own son, self-destruct in public without being able to do anything to stop it, a helplessness that any parent could feel. And that detail is exactly what makes the story go beyond the framework of Hollywood and become a mirror reflecting very real issues in American society, where personal success does not always come with family stability, where pressure, fame, and psychological wounds can quietly affect across generations. What is admirable about him is not that he is perfect, but that he did not walk away. He turned back to faith, participated in social activities, and continued to be present in the lives of those around him, even knowing he could not fix everything. And that is the biggest lesson. Not everyone can change the past, but everyone can choose how to face it. In a society like the United States, where people are often judged by success and external image, this story reminds us that true value lies in persistence, in not giving up on oneself, and in daring to admit that one is not perfect, but still continues to live with responsibility and meaning. If this story makes you think about your own life, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way to appreciate those who still stand firm even while carrying many wounds. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video where we continue to explore imperfect lives, but ones that have never given up.